who else brings a source of light? Who steals fire from the gods and brings it to the people?
Welcome back to Indie Gamers. Now Sylly's not flow.
And potential psychological function.
Today we're going to be listening to the psychology of religion. So it's pretty interesting because it's talking about God, blah, 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 but how fucking God is freaking flawed and doesn't do anything that is preaching and shit like that. So I'll leave it to you. I'm just going to do my morning routine and try to work and don't feel shy to come and chat with me. Join the Discord if you want to really participate with in the show. I know it's kind of weird, but why not? It is what it is. I'm a bit blue today. No, that's not the filter on that thing. So I'll get back to...
Man, this guy is actually perfect. And I actually have to go back and rethink my own morality, my own
do work, and hopefully
I'm
going to be a bit productive.
Right? And he realizes that all the darker aspects of his personality get projected onto her and their relationship. So it's that strange relationship where all that shadow is held. She has to hold all the negative aspects of him so that he can maintain that perfect face or persona to the outer world. So, if we expand this a bit, Christianity casts out the intrinsic evil within itself, or within the tradition, onto the figure of the devil.
Hello and welcome back to Indie Gamers.
If we are bad, we are tempted by the devil. And you can see here this idea of the ritual scapegoat, yet one would argue the scapegoat was also the catalyst for transformation. Casting that scapegoat out in Greek tradition and in Jewish tradition as well meant renewal for the community. And I'd just like to point out how interesting it is that in Christianity...
It's funny because a lot of people use the scapegoat but don't actually do the transformation. They just use the scapegoat to escape their responsibility.
The split between good and evil is a fantasy. We need to withdraw those projections, i.e. to not project all the negativity onto others, and to acknowledge the evil within ourselves, to not project this onto another figure.
A lot of people can't do that. It's the delusion they keep building forever and bully everyone else because I don't want to be aware of my flaws. I am perfect, I'm beautiful. Delusional.
At the societal level. Sorry about that. Only in this way can a more realistic and fulfilling relationship with the other be achieved. And, if you will, the devil is not all bad. It is that imperative which may seem to do evil that may actually end up doing good. Now, I always cringe when I ask this to my undergraduates because no one puts up their hand. But anyone read Faust, part 1? Okay, not bad. It's a relief. So he makes a connection, right? He amplifies again with the figure of Mephisto, right? Mephistopheles in Faust. And basically, Faust is a scholar. He's this introverted scholar who is only concerned with book learning, right? But that means he's actually one-sided because he doesn't necessarily know what it means to experience life. Mephisto is that energy, that catalyst that perhaps seems to be negative, but actually pushes him out of his bookly concerns, if you will, and actually into life itself, right? Now, obviously, this way of thinking is not unproblematic. Jung is basically positing the reality and existence of evil. This is the source of conflict and ultimately the major stumbling block in his relationship and dialogue with Father Victor White. And this surrounds the concept, if you will, of privatio boni, the privation of good. And basically this posits that evil itself has no existence, right? Even the most evil thing in the world still has a semblance of good. The light is never ever diminished, if you will, right? So the good cannot be banished and maintains its existence even in the most difficult circumstances. And Young said, well, actually, that's not true, right? The evil exists. We can kind of discuss it a bit more.
Travaillé pour Scafou pendant 16 ans.
Raja being a Manichaean, a dualist, and also
wow.
Now, moving on, nature dog. Have I missed a few slides here? I don't know. Here we go. The nature of God. Young goes on to describe God of the Old Testament, right, as portrayed in Answer to Job. And the God of the Old Testament here is a jealous God, right? Young would say he is an unreflecting God. Satan throws out a challenge that he would be able to sway even God's most stalwart and faithful servant Job. God is persuaded to allow Satan to do his worst, visiting upon Job affliction after affliction. God cannot deal with the idea of betrayal. Yet if he referred to his own omniscience, he would see that Job is and will remain faithful. However, God does not do that and allows Satan to put Job to the test. He kills his family, takes away his land, plagues him with diseases, sores, boils, etc. Others come to counsel Job, right, telling him that he must have done something wrong, that God would not punish him otherwise, and therefore he should repent and ask for God's forgiveness.
No, fuck God. Why do we need that figure of authority to give us forgiveness for just being human? You created us like that. Don't tell us, bow to you, so you can have we can have your forgiveness. That's fucking the drama of fucking Christianism. I need to have the authority over you.
Now, that's a very simplistic summary of the narrative.
Coercive control embedded within Christianity. Good job. And you think you're good Christians because you're a fucking bully
of consciousness. Job, a mere human,
that is accepted socially. Fuck you.
See some of the more blasphemous aspects of Young's thinking.
Fuck you, Pauline.
He shows God.
You're not a good person. You're a cunt.
The capacity for self-reflection. In many ways, Job is holding up a mirror to God and showing God what God is lacking. That God, too, is one-sided. In essence, Job is exposing God's shadow side, something that, within Young's psychology, must be acknowledged and integrated if psychological...
Fuck you, God. Ain't nobody got time for you.
And this is what
fucking die just yet, huh? We've been announcing your death for like 200 years and you're still there. That's what pissed me off. We still relate to you because we can't fucking move on from your delusion of being omnipotent and omnipresent and whatever. Fuck off.
In terms of Young psychology, it is only with consciousness and self-reflection that God
Stop harassing people, God.
at work.
You're not a nice person.
And the extent to which God's shadow is projected onto Job. And again, it being the scapegoat here, right? Job becomes the scapegoat for God's projections. A mortal man is thus helping God along his own path and process of individuation. The God of the Old Testament is in a wholly unconscious state, and for Young, individuation entails higher levels of consciousness, i.e. bringing that which is unconscious into consciousness, right? So that a strong enough container or ego is actually built. Now, thinking this through a little bit, right? So we have God as holding
No, we don't.
the Old Testament. We have this crucial role of a representation of humanity, i.e. Job. What do you think is the next logical step for Young then? How does God, if we can put God on the couch, because that's a big if, how does God continue this process of individuation?
God is a narcissistic psychopath, Machiavellian psychopath. God is the dark triad.
Can someone say it again?
Fucking leave him behind.
No. Anyone else?
Makes you believe he's all caring, but he's not. Duh.
Oh, fantastic. God's been
Move on from God. Ain't nobody got time for that.
To become human, right? To become reincarnated as Christ, right? So if we look at the figure of Christ, half divine, half human, right? God needs to learn about self-reflection and consciousness. Now, God must become more conscious to experience what Job has experienced. God incarnating as Christ is the only way God can become morally on par with humanity. We can see now why Answer to Job was on the Vatican list of banned books when it was actually published, alongside another vision of Christ that was pretty much along the same lines. Does anyone know what that is? I know I didn't put that on here. Nikos Kazantzakis, The Last Temptation, which was then made into a movie by Martin Scorsese. Harvey Keitel as Judas. Very interesting film. Jesus' life is the psychological drama of individuation. Jesus' physical suffering is God's suffering, both literally and metaphorically. So if we look to Jesus' life, what is it defined by? Sacrifice, pain. We talked about the notion of the scapegoat. It encapsulates all that individuation entails. Jesus' death and resurrection are also God's death and resurrection. Jesus' humiliation is God's humiliation. Equally, Jesus' triumph and redemption are also God's triumph and redemption. What all this points to for Young is a greater degree of consciousness. Young takes this one step further, right? The process is incomplete. If God of the Old Testament is one-sided, i.e. undifferentiated, vengeful, etc., then God of the New Testament is equally one-sided, right?
Duh.
And how is the God of the New Testament equally one-sided? I mean, he's thinking...
The delusion that God and every freaking Christian following his words are like, oh, I'm the bestest. I'm gonna bully you because I'm the bestest. I am delusional about being the bestest, therefore I can be a cunt to you, and I'm gonna still believe I'm the bestest. That's exactly the freaking problem with those fucking dumb religions.
Right? This ideal that personifies perfection rather than wholeness. And for Young, the real goal of the individuation process is not perfection, but wholeness. And wholeness actually entails being in touch with our shadow side, right? Knowing that we actually can't be perfect, that there's always going to be a darker aspect to ourselves that we need to integrate, that we actually need to be in dialogue with. Right. So, let's see where we are here.
I need to
So
draw.
God in the New Testament, i.e. the personification as Christ, does not fully realize the shadow side. Psychologically speaking, this is very dangerous when we live in extremes, not holding the tension of opposites. So basically what Young is seeing is this kind of huge oscillation between an image of God in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. And this relates to his idea of the self-regulating psyche. Basically, Young posits that our psyches, right, in essence, want to be in balance. Because it's only within this middle position that creativity actually can come forth. And we can describe that in a bit more detail later on. But when we tend to move to one side, right, when we tend to hold to one position, we are actually in danger of flipping to the complete opposite. So I can give you an example. So let's say my facade to the world, my persona is that of just the essence of machismo, right? I know I'm doing that right now, right? That I'm just ready to go. Anyone look at me the wrong way, let's go outside, man, right? Now, what Young is saying is that one-sidedness, right, that persona, that face we put to the world, it is actually compensated in the unconscious by something perhaps very fragile, right? Something that's been damaged. Right? We present that one-sided persona to protect that fragile essence that we cannot allow to be re-traumatized. Right? So for Young, the real essence of integrating and becoming who we are is to sit in balance, right? To not play just simply, I want to be this way, I want to be that way. Because if we do that, there is the danger of what he calls an enantiodromia. I would write in the right, but it's behind here. Right? This idea of a complete flip to its opposite. So I'll give you an example that stems from my youth. This probably shows how old I am. Do you remember the band Korn? Anyone remember the band Korn? Okay? They drove a tank down the streets of Toronto. I was there. It was fantastic. But one of the guitarists, right? I mean, if anyone knows anything about Korn, it starts in rock and roll, right? It is the essence of the rock and roll lifestyle. Fantastic. Okay? But there was really an indulgence with the drugs, with alcohol, etc. But one guitarist actually converts and finds God, right? Just like that.
Yeah, sure.
God. And at least, we can't speak to the psychology of this particular guitarist, but at the same time, the actual flip itself with no mediation from one extreme to the other means that some kind of transition was almost too quick to a certain extent, right? That there hasn't been some kind of processing of what we're actually trying to define by flipping to the complete opposite. So, if we move back to the life of Christ as personified in the New Testament, what Young is saying is that this flip has occurred in Christianity's conception of the Godhead, right? So in the New Testament, Jesus' temper is actually played down. His own struggles, his own fear, and humanity, which together, arguably, provide a more realistic image to which we may direct our worship. We are taught to worship and attain an unrealistic ideal.
Yep.
And that has, in part, impacted on the development of the Western psyche.
Yep.
And basically, what Jen is saying here is that, anyone who was born within the Christian tradition
don't even have a choice.
Asked to follow in the path of Christ, to imitate Christ, right? But really, what Jan is saying is that is just an unattainable idea.
This
right?
is bullshit.
Should not be to imitate Christ.
Christianism, Western religion is narrow-minded and
so to go back to life of Christ, we do not see these other manifestations of his personality. His denial of his family upon his return from Nazareth, his turning over of the tables of the money changers of the temple. And we know
delusion of wasps.
Right, in this particular instance. We see it in Josephus, but any of you who study psychology from an academic point of view with theology, this is in the same Gospels Q, which basically means that there's an agreement between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John, for all intents and purposes, is actually left out.
Yep.
Right? So essentially, Jesus' human aspects are denied. We focus on the divine, we fail to see the human.
We want to believe.
Prayer in Gethsemane, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass me by. So, how do we proceed from here? How do we address the one-sidedness of God in the New Testament? I'm not going to hit the slide yet. Anyone have any idea? I think the blasphemous thought through to its logical conclusion. Us. Right? It is now up to us. It is now up to the rest of humanity to continue the work of greater consciousness. And again, for me, this points to Young's radical humanist position. So Young used the examples of Pentecost. God descends on his disciples in the form of fiery tongues. It is up to us now to do the work, to continue God's individuation. Why? If we are made in the image of God and God incarnates within us, then our fullest realization also leads to God's realization and individuation. And this relates to Young's idea of treating the myth onward. Right? So it's not imitation, but fully living the values that Christ embodied in our own unique ways. Imitation can only take us so far. We must carve out our own path. What the story of Christ evidences is one way of achieving that goal. We need to find our own way to express this. The limitation of organized religion is basically this. It does not allow us to creatively live and experience the divine within. If anything, we develop what Freud would call a very harsh superego because we cannot attain that unrealizable ideal.
Exactly.
Now, let's take pause for a second here. There's a very dangerous implication to Young's thinking here, i.e. conceiving of the God of the Old Testament as opaque, unconscious, unreflective, etc., and the God of the New Testament as perhaps more developed, right? Again, one-sided as well, but definitely more developed from God of the Old Testament. So what's the implication here? Might have to weave in some of Young's history that we know as well. Absolutely, right? God of the Old Testament, right? The Yahweh, the God that is the object of worship for Judaism, is less developed than the God of the New Testament, i.e. Western Christendom. Now, some of you might say, well, maybe it's just its developmental theories, etc. But as Luke pointed out, if you look to the accusations against Young, right, with anti-Semitism during that period, very robust actually, arguments and concerns, then you can see this in a different light, right? There's a very slippery slope here in terms of how Jung is thinking here. Obviously, that's another lecture in and of itself, but if you go to Q, right, the archives in Q, you will find a dossier that was that was compiled, basically urging that Jung be tried for war crimes. Right? Now, this obviously didn't come to fruition. There's obviously multiple ways to approach this debate and to access this, but certainly it's the shadow side of analytical psychology that we all have to acknowledge and deal with if we're going into this discipline. Now, moving on, Sophia, wisdom. So if you read the book of Job, there's this real interesting interlude. Right? It almost seems like it comes out of nowhere, that the narrative is going one way, and then all of a sudden, bam, Sophia. Right? So Jung is trying to understand this very interesting pause, if you will, in the narrative itself. So Sophia is the personification of wisdom. How does Jung interpret this? Now we have to say this is definitely some questionable theology. Right?
Sophia is my
providing symbolic interpretations that assume a certain continuity.
all these
But doing this does not necessarily pay heed to the historical and contextual work that is required.
worship Sophia.
I'm not a theologian, but I've worked with theologians, and trust me, they're really interested in the nitty-gritty. So basically, this psychological theorizing, while very interesting perhaps, and potentially seductive as well, doesn't actually do justice to what other people are doing in other disciplines. Right? And Jung is not necessarily understanding these texts integrally, right? So just keep that in the back of your mind. But this is his interpretation. Wisdom is needed for self-reflection, which God lacks. Jung determines that God has forgotten wisdom, personified by the female figure of Sophia, who was also present when all was created. Her memory, role, and importance need to be revived. For Jung, Western religion is missing the feminine aspect and what this feminine symbolizes. If Western religion is to thrive, to be able to contain once more the religious needs and experiences of Western civilization, it needs to integrate this aspect.
Yep.
Does this happen? For Jung, there are certainly signs of hope. And I've put it there, so I don't want to ask you anyways, right? He really is reinvigorated by the Assumption of Mary. So, 1950, the Assumption of Mary is a papal bull that declares Mary, Mother of God, was brought up into heaven after her bodily death. Right? So after her death, body and soul, she was lifted up to heaven. This, for Jung, symbolizes her equivalence and godlike status in relation to the Trinity, i.e. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. For Jung, the Trinity cannot express completion For Jung, the Trinity cannot express completion, and as it stands, resonates in overtly masculine energy and emphasis. So you could argue that the Holy Spirit is more neutral energy, anyways. But if you look at Father and Son, there's definitely something very masculine there. What Mary's Assumption facilitates is an acknowledgement of the feminine, and all this entails symbolically: embodiment, relationality, etc., etc. And for Jung, the number 4, not 3, resonates completion. Now, why is that? Again, this is problematic, how Jung is working, because you could say, well, I can look to mythology, all the different cultures of the world, and 7 is actually really, a crucial number. But
it's funny, I've said that for the last 10 years, if not more, 15 years. It's because you can't be taking shape completely if you only consider only 3 point. Let me show you.
So Lauren, give me some examples of what comes in 4.
3 point means 2D.
What's that? Fantastic. That's
4 points means
points. Right? 4 seasons, 4 elements, 4 evangelists, so on and so forth. Right? So this is the type of thinking, the type of approach, methodological approach that Jung is using. So finding the 4th is finding completion. We get closer to
you have to live in the real world. 3 points, 1, 2, 3, that's a triangle. But if you want to live in 3D, you have to have the fourth one that creates the depth of life.
There are also other personifications of the feminine, and to only emphasize one is to limit the range of ways in which femininity may be expressed. So we have to drop them down.
That's why you need four.
Aphrodite, the sexual and seductive. Nonetheless, Young interpreted the
three
assumption of Mary to be an occasion of significant psychological importance.
Spectrum,
Evidence the possibility
and
that
remember to have the one
organized
encapsulating everything, giving some depth to it.
to re-enchant a society that has become disenchanted with and because of religion.
Yeah.
In terms of his psychology, it was the recognition of the archetypal anima. I won't get too much into the anima, but just the kind of crux of what I want to say here. I'd argue that this is a real turning point in Jung's ambivalent stance towards organized religion. Sorry, that's
The delusion.
we can talk about that. Okay. By
Delusion of
1957,
religion.
in
I think I actually noted that a while ago.
Jung sees religion as one way in which individuals may defend against mass-mindedness, i.e. this notion of group psychology, the mass doesn't think, right? The individual gets lost in the mass, and in this sense, he's not different from Laban and Freud. So with no religious framework that will sufficiently contain and experience the numinous, the godlike status is attributed to the state, and the state serves as an outlet for the religious function of the psyche. But in the state, the individual loses his or her individuality. The state is ruled by generalities and averages, which in turn facilitates mass-mindedness. So there's a blind following. People are always caught in a frenzy.
Ooh, what do you mean my blind spot are not good? I should challenge and try to recognize my blind spot? Of course not. I want to believe because my delusions give me, in my perception, the right to control and believe. Congratulations, you're a good person.
Or woman who is well organized in his or her individuality as the mass itself. The real shift is that for Jung, this individuality may be facilitated within organized religion. However, my reading of this is debatable, but I'd like you to point you to the evidence in the text I believe, is showing Jung leaving more room for the expansion, if you will, of Christianity. So for Jung, religion opposes stately authority with the authority of a higher power. Just as man, as a social being, cannot in the long run exist without a tie to the community, so the individual will never find the real justification for his existence and his own spiritual and moral autonomy anywhere except in an extra-mundane principle capable of relativizing the overpowering influence of external factors. The individual who is not anchored in God can offer no resistance on his own resources to the physical and moral blandishments of the world. And he continues, his, i.e. the individual relation to God would be an effective shield against these pernicious influences, end quote. Arguably, there is some tension and ambiguity here. One could suggest that Jung is emphasizing the one-to-one experience with God, i.e. not the God of organized religion, right? That he's really talking about the God within. But in light of his theorizing in answer to Job and his renewed faith in Christianity's psychological advancement, one may argue that there is an openness in Jung that allows for a profound hope that organized religion can play the role of a potent faith standing against mass-mindedness. And for me, this is the quintessential quotation. That is not to say that Christianity is finished. I am, on the contrary, convinced that it is not Christianity, but our conception and interpretation of it that has become antiquated in face of the present world situation. The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seed.
Christians use Christianity for
it
their
can go on
own
developing. It depends only on us
advantage.
whether we can make up our minds to
That's the bad faith that I'm trying to highlight. Your bad faith is turning your religion into a fucking system of control, when originally it was fine. You, the good Christian, is screwing your own belief system because you're human. You are the flaw that your God is trying to tell you are. And you're like, I don't want to believe that.
So, very quickly, let's
that's the problem, darling. You don't want to believe that you can be a fucking camp.
If you want. So, critiques against Jung's psychology of religion. Jung basically treats God like an individual patient, right? God is not a human being and can't be proverbially put on the couch. Number two, Jung supposes he has a hotline to God. And this is not me. There's a critique against him which basically said Jung feels he's got a hotline to God. Three, Jung attempts to replace one religious framework with another, i.e. therapy. And this is really, well argued, although this book is problematic itself. In Richard Knowles' text, The Jung
You use your religion as a tool to make yourself believe you're good, and as a tool to believe everyone else that you are the one
the Jewish philosopher Martin
hypnotized by the light, casting a huge shadow on everyone else because you don't want to recognize your own shadow. You use your religion as a tool to fool and bully.
Right? This is a one-way conversation.
Use it as a way to protect yourself from your own
concepts and not seeing the phenomenon on its own terms. Right? So in terms of Buddhist philosophy, this is a monologue rather than true dialogue.
Shady.
Jung also reduces the experience of God, reduces the experience of God. And basically, Buber had this notion of the I-it versus the I-thou relationship. Does anyone know about I-it and I-thou? Yes?
Buber was existential.
Mm-hmm.
So, an I-it relationship sort of seems to be looking at people as an object, and I-thou is where we see it more as a human, as a equal.
Yeah, fantastic. So there's a real, in the I-thou relationship, which is the essence or the true expression of dialogue, there it is kind of humility, right? And this kind of equal footing with which we approach that conversation. What Buber is suggesting by saying Jung's psychology is only working at the I-it level is that he's not approaching religion on the equal footing, right? He's got this conquistador approach, this very colonizer's model, where he wants to only use religion to show the efficacy and the truth, if you will, of his psychological ideas. So he's not meaning the other as other. And basically, there's a very interesting back and forth. And Jung replies, it wasn't the most robust and convincing reply from Jung's part, but he gets quite angry. And he basically says to Buber, how dare you tell me that I have no idea of the numinous, right? That I'm only working at the level of the I-it rather than the I-thou. And he goes on to invite Buber to come with him into a mental asylum, right? So perhaps some of you know, when Jung started his training, he was working with schizophrenics at perhaps the most prestigious hospital in the world at that time, the Volkswagen Mental Hospital. And he basically invites Buber to come to a mental asylum and say, I will show you my patients, right? You come walk with me, and then you tell me whether or not I have an inkling of what the numinous means, right? Whether or not I'm truly talking about I-it or I-thou. It is clear from Jung's interpretation of Christianity that he took an unorthodox approach to interpreting the psychology of religion, one based arguably on finding parallels and evidence of his own psychological contentions. This at times conquistador approach to applied psychoanalysis is equally apparent in his interpretation of the psychology of Eastern religions. Regardless of his potential good intentions and his attempt to build bridges with the East, there are implications to the theoretical violence that may stem from the application of a psychology that is historically situated in the West, one that may not see the East on its own terms, one that promotes a monologue rather than a true dialogue. And it is to Jung's engagement with the East that we now turn. So everyone just take a few seconds. Close that. And we're back to not much of a break. Sorry about that, everyone. Let's see. Oh, but here we go. More break. And then, okay. From the outset, it is very important to note that Jung's views on the East are not really about the East. Right? Jung's views on the East are not about the East. If anything, it tells us something about the West and Western thinking. It is, in psychoanalytic terms, Jung's fantasy of the East filtered through the lens of his psychology. That is not to say that fruitful ideas do not stem from Jung's engagement. They did. But as with Jung's interpretation of Christianity, you need to be mindful of an approach that prioritizes the strengthening of a set of ideas, one that is constantly searching for greater legitimacy and recognition in the medical sciences. J.J. Clark and Harold Coward, two separate scholars, both wrote books called Young Eastern Thought. Right? One British was at Kingston University, one Canadian at Calgary. And they both argue convincingly that Jung's concepts such as the self, individuation, archetypes, the collective unconscious, and active imagination were shaped by texts and ideas from the ancient traditions of China and India. Jung uses the East as cultural evidence in conjunction with his method of application to formulate cultural psychology that transcended his clinical material. For example, central to Jung's psychology are the concepts of the collective unconscious and the archetypes. And these ideas certainly forward the perspective of collectivity and universality. If we can find parallels in the materials of the East that point to the same themes as those covered in the West, that Eastern forms of these themes crop up in the dreams and fantasies of Westerners, we have provided, at least according to Jung, potentially compelling evidence and an argument that his conception of the psyche was correct, that it can transcend cultural boundaries and we actually share more in common than we actually believe. There are other similarities between Jung's way of working and Eastern thought. The East's capacity for introspection and the grasp of the need for inner transformation and self-realization seems remarkably similar to Jung's own therapeutic endeavors. In essence, he is, once again, mining the cultural products of the world to find proof to validate the psychological approach and clinical methods. He also wanted to highlight that the West had neglected to explore and take seriously the inner life and psychological reality. Engaging in Eastern thought acts as a corrective to this lack. And I think here we can see Jung's notion of compensation working. Turning to the East compensates and brings back into balance the West's neglect of the East. It emphasizes the marginalization of Eastern thought in the West and brings into question the perceived superiority of the West. Jung's emphasis on learning about cultures other than his own is also a statement about how therapists need to move beyond the individual in order to help their patients. So this is, really reflective of why Jung actually went into mythology in the first instance. Right? It's not just that he was fascinated by mythology, and we're really going back to this time of the books here. And basically, he's working with schizophrenic patients, right? He was actually living, in the asylum itself and interacting with these patients on a day-to-day basis, several times a day in some instances. And basically what he's realizing in these fantasies that they're telling him was a lot of mythological material, right? And what he determined, which was revolutionary back then, is that there was actually some logic here. These people are not insane, right? We shouldn't just kind of push them into one place, lock the door, and throw away the key. So
that's what they try to do.
The reason why he started studying thought is
If you ever confront my delusion, I will ostracize you and scapegoat you without even considering that I might be the fucking person that with giant psychological issues. I don't want to even consider I might have problems myself. I can't have problems. I am the son or the daughter of God. I am only perfect. And that's why the delusion is fucking screwing everyone. Their delusion is
right? So in essence, it was quite
the flow of Christianism, the human. Their craziness is making everyone else miserable because they are imposing their delusion on everyone else, and that's why it doesn't work in the world.
Etc. This material crops up in fantasies and the dreams of Western patients. Right? So in order for the therapist
the need for control,
they need to transcend these cultural boundaries. It demands our understanding, and to do so, the therapist needs to consider the wider social.
they are so unable to
of thoughts and images.
acknowledge they could be assholes, that they're making everyone else and bully everyone else to believe they can't be.
Studying Buddhism in greater detail. Arguably, however, this interest was sparked as early as his childhood, when he recalls being captivated by myths.
Perfectly.
We also know that Jung practiced
And they fucking believe they are the
confrontation with the unconscious. So really,
The compass of morality.
Excuse me. There are also some brief references to Oriental ideas in student lectures, the Zwingli lectures. The Zwingli Society was his fraternity. And there are also indications of his engagement with Eastern ideas in his first quote-unquote Jungian books, i.e. when he's beginning to carve his own identity. So the earlier forms, if you will, of what is now known as symbols of transformation, as well as the book on psychological types. And here he's emphasizing the ideas of duality, the complementary nature of opposites, the need of finding a middle path to mediate the opposites. So again, pointing to this notion of the self-regulating psyche, we're seeing how both Buddhist and Taoist ideas are finding their way into Young psychology. Now, mandalas, right? Young uses a lot of mandalas. He draws mandalas. He actually begins drawing them and doesn't realize that he's drawing mandalas until he meets Richard Wilhelm, right? He points into these texts and then he goes, aha, right? It's a mandala that I'm actually drawing. Right? So usually with the mandala, you'll have this idea, right, of a circle, and usually 4 cardinal points, i.e. this number of 4 as completion, or some variation of 4 within the larger circle. And Jung begins to notice them arising not only in his own dreams, but in the dreams of his patients, right? And he really begins to, to cultivate this as a part of their
narcissistic can be an anagram for Christianity,
right? To create these mandalas, to create their own versions of the
Maybe
radical.
it could be actually
Now, what the really Christianity begins to see that the
There's an
mandala
edge. There's no edge in
that transcends all cultures.
narcissistic
And if the individual
Christian.
psyche has a soul, a city, a geographical space has a soul. And that mandala is really pointing to a similar thing, i.e. this notion of the self, right? This potential for wholeness and completion. So if you look at many cities,
It's close.
especially the older cities,
It's
you'll
freaking
find
close.
that the city, right, the
Christian.
city itself is usually constructed as a
Of
space for collectivity, but also in many instances
the S.
is constructed as a mandala. There's also
Wow,
the concept
there's
of
just-
yin yang, i.e. of opposites, but for him it's also a representation of his theory of conscious sexual opposites, i.e. the anima and animus respectively. But, getting into the crux of it, Jung believed that an engagement with Eastern thought must begin from a Western perspective, i.e. the importance of maintaining the strong enough ego or container.
Wow, that's pretty close.
By nature closer to the unconscious, its access to it is very different from the West's. It is possible, therefore, that the Western psyche may become overwhelmed if engaging with the East from a symbol set and system that is not of their own making, one that is not entrenched in the traditions of a specific geographical space. So for Jung, the container essentially does not fit the purpose. The West must engage the unconscious on its own terms, and not adopting wholesale an approach that is opposed to its own. There are obviously implications to this way of thinking, and for me, I encountered this in Young, I think back to my days as a history student, and it begs the question of whether the East can exist on its own terms, i.e. can there be a history of the East without Western encroachment? Is the East only noteworthy on the world stage once the West has entered the picture? So, returning to Young's position, there is a wisdom to be gained from the East, i.e.
Yes, that would be the edge.
But equally, the East reaches an awareness of the unconscious and through dangerous means and spiritual practices.
It's pretty close. Narcissist, Christian.
One-sided, extroverted, and overly rational.
I can be twisted into a pun for sure.
Realities of the here and now. It seeks to escape from reality rather than dealing with it.
Stop escaping from reality, assholes.
Disciplines such as science and history may reach a more related and meaningful contact with the unconscious, one mediated by and firmly planted in an embodied existence that does not deny the physicality of life. If we wish to heal the problems of the Western world, to speak to its disenchanted state by re-enchanting existence through engagement with the unconscious and its connection to the luminous, then turning to the East does not get to the root of the problem. In fact, it could cause greater disequilibrium. For instance, and this is Jung's interpretation, yoga's aim is to become one with the unconscious, to obliterate consciousness altogether and to unite with the ultimate reality. Read psychologically, it amounts to either over-identification or psychosis, i.e. because the strong ego or container is lacking, one is over-identifying with the contents of the unconscious rather than being in relationship with them. So essentially, Jung had to maintain and firmly, planted in his Western perspective. He could not accept the loss of an ego. If higher selfhood were attained, we still need an ego or consciousness to process that such a state has been achieved. No ego means no awareness of the state of being has been reached. This seems peculiar, right? In light of the actions of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, once nirvana is achieved, he chose not to become sattva, but decided to return to earthly existence so that he may teach others. Not only does this note a crucial stage in the hero's journey, i.e. the theme of withdrawal and return, it evidences a return to consciousness, i.e. an appreciation for the phenomenal world, and an understanding that nirvana can only be reached in our incarnation as humans. Jung ultimately rejects any fully realized state of illumination, for he states that individuation cannot be achieved in one's lifetime. Only in death can a semblance of individuation be achieved. Ultimately, for Jung, life is about tension, right, and dialectical opposition. It is only intention that creativity and new possibilities are achieved. And this relates to his idea of the transcendent function. So basically what he's saying here is that, when people are growing, when they're developing, there comes a point where crucial decisions need to be made, right? And again, Jung is against rushing in to one way of doing things, right? This is the way to do it, boom. He's actually advocating sitting in the middle, right? Of not being tempted to
Agree.
one position or the other.
Because if you can find your equilibrium at the center, then you are not on the left, you are not on the right.
Literally means
You are the pivoting point, where you can go in any direction.
But allowing for a new possibility to arise. And this new possibility could be something entirely new, i.e. not a disposition or that, or it could be a combination of those two positions as well. So just give you a very, hopefully a real life example.
Integrate your shadow so you don't unbalance the world with your brightness, the light, the good that is actually not requested, not demanded, not expected. You with your good, believing that you're saving everyone with your faith is what is unbalancing the world. You do shady shit in the name of the light.
And really sit with the tension that this causes and not knowing where you're going. Something new might actually arise, perhaps a third possibility, right? That is either not any one of these, but again, it could be any combination of the two. Maybe you'll be allowed to work in California for part of the time and still have to be in the UK. Who knows, right? But psychologically, the real aim is, again, not to jump to either one-sided position. Now, if we return to Jung's psychology of Western religions, you can see why, for him, the cross is actually the quintessential example of this idea of transcendent function. Because Christ being crucified on the cross is that image of suffering and tension, what it means to be pulled in different directions. And in the case of Christ, it's the human.
The cross is the unbalanced
And what actually gives birth
symbol of Christianism.
possibility of being reborn as something different. So, going back to Jung's ideas on
You
Eastern
check
thought,
the
complete liberation
Star of
from
David
suffering
or the yin yang, it has a balance.
psychosis. So as it becomes clear, Jung was against
Not for everyone.
imitating Eastern practices, and as mentioned earlier, he championed the individual authenticity when engaging archetypal imperatives and narratives.
Authenticity?
Proverbial
What?
the myth onwards. In this way, Jung is displaying a strong sense of the cultural and historical embeddedness of religious and philosophical beliefs. Mainly, our contexts have shaped our egos in very particular ways. And this emphasis finds expression in his distinction between an archetype and an archetypal image. I won't jump into that now, but we can certainly discuss that during the question period at that period. This is the point. Engaging with the practices of another culture leads to superficial imitation. We cannot fully integrate and understand another culture. We will always be alienated. We will always be the outsiders. But what Jung is arguing against is what we might call today a consumerist attitude to cultural products, i.e. seeing culture as a commodity. Religious beliefs are now encapsulated in fads, fashions, jewelry, etc. But this doesn't necessarily speak to the true emotion and feeling at the heart of the experience of newness. We pick and choose, like we're in a candy store.
Cherry picking.
A bit of that, a bit of this, rather than staying close to and working with the images that our own culture has created and inherited. It betrays an attitude of not wanting to stick to things, not wanting to work things through, a throwaway culture defined by consumption. So, here's a whole bunch of answers. Just the very smallest nick in my jeans right here. What I do, I'll run out and go a new pair. Well, back in the day, no one could actually do that. You amend it, right? But although there is something commendable in Jung's ideas here and what he's forwarding, we have to appreciate or take into consideration that he's coming from a position of privilege. So yes, he grew up poor, but he actually married into the second wealthiest family in Switzerland at the time, right? So he's not coming from a position of lack at all, right? He has the choice to make those decisions, i.e. to mend his trousers or not. So we cannot abandon our Western heritage. It is within the framework of Western religion that we must work. We can further understand then the hope Jung felt with the Assumption of Mary and the subsequent hope that he expressed in the undiscovered self, i.e. the possibility that Western Christendom can begin to shift and to change once again to contain the development of the inner life of Westerners. Now, sorry, missed that slide. Critiques against Jung's approach to the East. Clearly, that's potentially Eurocentric, right? In Jung's defense, we could argue that Jung was reflecting his own time and context, but within our own context, his approach seems restrictive. He could not foresee the nature of our globalized world and diaspora communities and the benefits that these developments may bring. In that sense, Jung could be exaggerating the extent to which we are rooted in our own culture, especially in light of the fact that many today carry with them hybrid identities, right? That we're not just one thing. We don't identify with being this way or that. And in essence, even if we're not in tension between different cultures, certainly our notions of identity are constantly shifting, constantly being negotiated as well. Jung, in perceiving East and West in such strict dichotomous ways, may be perpetuating popular stereotypes. He uses phrases like the mysterious Orient and the baffling mind of the East. And this in turn reinforces prejudices, and perhaps Jung is guilty of what Psyche describes as Orientalism. Jung's interpretation constitutes yet another narrative that promotes the colonizer's model of the world. But also note the inherent dualism in Jung's thinking. By setting up West and East, us versus other, he's creating a binary that contradicts the essence and the implications of his notion of the collective unconscious, i.e., fundamentally, we are all interconnected and the same. Jung is also working with corrupted sources. He's not using the strongest translations, and the secondary sources he uses were clearly biased and reflect their own time. By not being critical about these, he inherits these limitations, i.e., they become central and core to his own psychological tenets. We are left to ask, was Jung truly engaging in a dialogue with the East, or was it a one-sided conversation? J.J. Clark is adamant that Jung was aiming to build a bridge of understanding with Eastern thought and really contributed to the growing appreciation of the East in the West. In raising the profile of the East in the West, Jung was fighting against rationalism and scientific positivism, perspectives that may remain closed to a multiplicity of perspectives. And essentially, what you can't deny is that Jung is providing a multiplicity. He's basically saying that there are multiple God images, not just one, and they're all equally valid. He's thus destabilizing the belief that the West is best and that there is only the rest. All God images are equally valid and express our experience of the divine. But it is undeniable that his psychology remains his reference point, constituting the foundation from which he is engaging the East. This leads to a misinterpretation of Eastern texts, beliefs, and practices. Clark rightly points out that Jung fails to grasp Eastern metaphysics on its own terms. For example, in yoga, what is sought is the possibility of a higher state of consciousness, in which awareness is not obliterated, but transformed into a condition where the concerns and limitations of the individual ego cease to be of central concern or importance. Another example. Any karate practitioners here? Any karateka? Okay, fantastic. You know about kata, right? Do you know Sanshin? Yeah, okay. So basically, the essence of Sanshin is the merging, if you will, of mind, body, and spirit. Sanshin literally translates as the three battles, right? But when you're performing the kata, and especially at the higher levels, you're completely embodied. You're marrying the breath with the movement itself. And at the higher levels, you're integrating that spiritual aspect. So I think it's definitely wrong for Jung to kind of go in and say that the East is only really leading to a disembodied experience and engagement with the unconscious. Jung thus misunderstands the nature of things like yoga and meditation and fails to appreciate that there are many forms of yoga, not just one. He is ultimately basing his criticism on a Western account of one form of yoga. So he is guilty of a failure to appreciate complexity, and perhaps this is one major reason why Jung's place in the academy is so fragile. In essence, his universalist approach is not in line with the nature of specialization that defines academia today. Perhaps Jung's complex and at times ambivalent relationship to Eastern thought may be summarized by the following vignette, and with which I will end my talk. While in India in 1938, Jung had the opportunity to meet with Sri Ramana Maharshi, a Hindu sage who many believed to be an enlightened being. Jung decides not to go. So the meeting was set up, right, by actually one of Jung's followers. Everything was, good, organized, and then he stays on the boat, right? And his excuse is that he had found the key to his psychology, i.e. his study of alchemy. So he actually had some texts shipped to him, right, to India so that he could start engaging with it. So all this work that went into organize this meeting, he just doesn't show up. And J.J. Clark provides an insightful interpretation. In order to maintain his stance of independence, Jung felt it necessary to avoid a man who, by repute, may well have been able to penetrate his defenses. For just as he had since his boyhood refused to bend his knee to the Christian way of faith, So with regard to Eastern spirituality, his attitude remained one of guarded objectivity. He could not, quote, accept from others what I could not attain on my own, or make any borrowings from the East, but must shape my life out of myself. And that's it. Yes, questions, concerns?
I was wondering, what do you think would have happened if Jung was a psychiatrist in the 1930s when he was observing patients who were diagnosed at that time with psychosis or however it was termed, if they'd been prescribed antipsychotics, and if he, during his red book phase himself, had been prescribed some antipsychotic, would that change his kind of development?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know if I could say for certain, what Jung would have felt about that, but I can certainly frame it within, the debate that's occurring on whether or not, this medication or the medications that are prescribed, actually do benefit. So Davies's book, what was it called again? Fascinating book. Basically surrounding how the medication itself, many of them are placebos, right? That in essence, some of the benefits don't necessarily outweigh the damage that could be caused by taking some of these pills, etc. I guess what Jung would say is that, when you work with patients, there has to be a certain equilibrium. So if we're going to use the talking therapies in particular, if there isn't a certain foothold in consciousness,
I need to draw.
That's actually present, then it would be very difficult to work with such patients, especially if you're delving into unconscious material that could potentially overwhelm them. So I think the perspective, at least from the standpoint of talking therapies, is that perhaps we'd like to believe that in many instances the talking therapies can be used as a cure without medication. But I would argue that sometimes if you don't have, if people don't have that kind of stable connection to society, that this type of medication, antipsychotics, etc., could be used in conjunction with the therapy, right? Or that it could be used first, the pills can be used first to gain, if you will, a quote-unquote stable state, and then perhaps the talking therapies might be more effective. Yes?
So I'd like to get more information about individuation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I understand that one must go a period of isolation to feel the transformation this individuation.
Mm-hmm.
So you base yourself on how people react to you. So you need to go by yourself to really find yourself, your higher self.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that so Jesus did this when he went into the wilderness for 40 days. And I believe that shamans and numbers and
Okay.
Sure. But these are all types of inspiration. I also think inspiration to journey of enlightenment. And I was speaking to a Buddhist monk about this last week. I said, what do you mean to enlightenment? You basically described what you were saying about God's shadow. You say it's a removal of God's shadow, so you don't feel that anymore. You just feel like pure love and passion. Grief and spite of all those kind of human conditions doesn't exist anymore. Is that possible?
Is it possible within our contemporary context? Is that the question?
Yeah. I mean, put this on it.
Sure. Sure.
You're saying that no one can do it in their lifetime. So
Yeah.
you have to,
Potentially. I mean, again, he's working from a very particular framework, an idea of what individuation means. So these kind of narratives of the Buddha, religious leaders, Christ, etc., again, point to, I wouldn't say necessarily a fantasy, but a story that helps us realize that the goal can be achieved. But in essence, the goal is the journey itself, right? Once we've achieved something, wow, fantastic, we've done it. But I guess for for Young, it's more about that struggle, right? That kind of
That struggle.
to find what it really means to be you. Whether or not other people have, attained that in different cultures, etc., I guess it points back to his reservations, right? It's, again, maybe because he was so embedded with his own way of thinking, right? With his own kind of Western bias and perspective that he perhaps couldn't appreciate that there may be outlets and ways to actually, to achieve that. But I think the larger implication of your question, which I find very interesting, is whether any form of individuation following this process of withdrawal, return, periods of kind of retreat and self-expression, self-exploration, whether or not it's possible within our technological world, right? Because even when we go on holidays now, we've got our phone, right? And if you think back to this context, they had the privilege perhaps of just going away, right? Convalescing, getting out of here, etc. But now we're so kind of hyper-connected, one might question whether or not individuation as Jung defined it is truly possible in our context. And if so, if such self-exploration and self-knowledge is possible, whether or not it can look different, right? And it might include the technological in some way, because in many ways it just seems impossible now, right? There's just this hyper-connectivity, right? So I think the larger thing that I find interesting in your question is that yes, individuation might be possible, but it might not be the way Jung described it. Yes?
That's very much follow.
Yeah.
Also, that I said earlier, I don't know if you were here, but I heard this sort of. I go through periods of depression and mania, and I would say that my depression is very similar to this isolation. I withdraw from the world, and I stay in my bed. I don't want to leave. I don't want to speak to anyone. And I'm just in myself, in my own head. And I go through this, about a year, sometimes even a half. And I come out of that, and then I experience the reverse of it, the meaning of behind the isolation. And I feel like that depression is
Hypnotized by the light.
I feel like I'm disconnecting. I feel like I'm withdrawing to myself. During that period, I feel a loss of identity. I don't know who I am. When I come out of it, I feel more attuned to who I am again. So I feel like it is kind of like a growth period of introspection. It's not depression. Not the depression to your point.
No, thank you for sharing that. I mean, if you want to speak after, definitely you can combine it, yeah. Yes?
You just make you need the context. For me, it's like everything evolves in our life. So psychotherapy is not, it's an evolutionary process. Freud came up with ideas, he was engaged with mostly people who are neurotic. Freud was quite clear, he couldn't actually understand people with what were more profound experiences, which we now often misuse to call psychosis. Because it's a loaded word. So you must be very in that respect. But I do think that this effort to understand human nature through mythology, because going out and journey coming back is in every culture. So there's universal connectors. Why Star Wars so popular? Same thing. Who advised Star Wars? They were people by Jungian writings.
Well, yeah, just Campbell.
Those are Campbell. For me, that flirtation with East is something new. Now, CBT is being sold as in the panacea, but it comes unstuck with people with profound experience. So now for dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness therapy. So that means, are we practicing mindless CBT? Or is that Kentucky Fried Buddhism? Packaging, Buddhism, is an idea to packaging and selling. That's what I talk about in the last. We are the consumer society, we are packaging and selling, and Eastern philosophy is no exception.
Sure. I mean, one question that certainly arises within the talking therapies is that less people are seeking out therapy, right? Because in essence, it's different from what CBT offers. I mean, analysis.
I disagree. CBT is another prescription. Somebody telling you how to think and how to rationalize.
Sure.
So it's a game from experiential. That's the paradox. Dialogue is about able to have an experience, because that's what the philosopher talks about. Thesis, antithesis leading to synthesis. We are no longer allowed to do that.
Right.
So in a regulated society, evidence-based society, freedom of thought is heresy.
Sure.
Freedom of action is blasphemy.
Sure. So I think what I was trying to say is that Jung's position, especially I guess with the talking therapies, I mean, if you look at it, there have been studies now that are trying to show the efficacy of Jungian analysis, and perhaps that is a consequence of the more kind of scientific evidence framework that we find ourselves in. But essentially, you have to look at what the goal of therapy actually is. So within, Jungian analysis and even Freudian analysis, it is potentially a lifelong journey, right? You've got periods where you're in therapy, there are periods you withdraw from therapy, and there might be times that you actually go back in. So if you kind of use the scientific method to confine it, i.e., can you within 10 sessions we see a difference? Well, you're not going to see that with Jungian therapy and Freudian therapy, and that's why it's been relegated from the NHS to a large extent. Right? Now you have these therapies like CBT, which I don't think are not useful. I think they do serve a purpose. But if if as a consequence, people are coming back for more referrals, more than the 5 sessions or 10 sessions, whatever it is, then you have to ask whether or not this is actually the most cost-effective way to be in. Because in essence, it might be allowing one to engage with an immediate problem, but it might not be speaking to the larger themes, which I think Jung would basically say is disenchantment. Right? The disenchantment that perhaps has roots both in the personal and collective unconscious, both in our personal experiences, but also the more kind of existential and larger concerns that we all share as humanity. One thing we ask within the Jungian community is whether or not there can be a Jungian version of short-term therapy, and it really seems to just come into conflict, because in essence, the epistemology is absolutely different. Right? It's not about the short-term efficacy, but you also have to see therapy as a business, because that is the shadow side of it. Therapists have to make a living, right? And if they're not making a living, you have to perhaps find ways to kind of facilitate, just individual subsistence, if you will. Right? So it's definitely a loaded debate. Yes.
I was reading about young criticized Freud and sort of 7 character flaws that he used method for to see whether he was wrong and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
What would you think the equivalent of that is for Jung in terms of the character flaws?
Yeah, I mean, in the history of psychoanalysis, the way that they begin to attack each other is saying that you're nuts, right? And it really boils down back to that relationship with Freud and Jung, that there was so much invested in the relationship that when it actually ended, it was absolutely devastating. Freud retaliates, right, with this history of the psychoanalytic movement, which basically marginalizes Jung. And then in essence, what it arises, based on the prerogative of Ernest Jones, is the secret committee. Does anyone know this stuff? I mean, the Freudian's not into it, that's a fallacy. Does anyone know about the secret committee? So basically, it's Freud's closest followers brought together to protect Freud, to forward an orthodox understanding of psychoanalysis, but also to attack anyone who would betray that. And symbolically, what Freud gives to each individual member is a signet ring. Right? So this is the personification of Lord of the Rings, right? And Freud has the one ring that controls them all. So there is certainly something mythical, but I think my point is that in the history of psychoanalysis itself, they're always trying to set off with each other. Now, depending on what you read in terms of Jung and Freud, if it's aimed at a more public audience, you'll actually be quite appreciative of Freud, right? And his critique of Freud will always be framed within a kind of gentler approach. But if you read texts that were intended for the scientific community, that were intended for his followers, he just goes for it. And essentially, he sets Freud out as a strongman. That Freud believes this, right? But I do this. Freud's notion of the unconscious, it only goes so far as my notion of the personal unconscious. I go one better. I go to the collective unconscious. So in essence, he is using Freud as a strawman in this kind of argumentation. But essentially, that's what they were doing back then, right? Because you couldn't divorce, in many ways, the personal from the larger debates. Does that answer your question?
Yes, well, and I'm thinking how about what do you think Jung has other flaws?
Absolutely.
Insecurities, things like that.
Sure. I mean, I think, again, with MDR, he wanted a biography of him, works and all. But certainly, you could argue that there's been a conflict between theory and practice. Now, he was amazing analyst, but he did some questionable things as well. One patient was late once, what did he do? He got in the sailboat and went off. And when the patient actually arrived, the patient's kind of waving him down. Can you come back to me? No, he keeps going. He had a really flawed sense of decorum sometimes. So anyone who is a therapist, who knows of therapy, a patient might walk in and instantly, within the first 10 minutes, you know what's wrong with that person. But you won't say it right away. Because that person needs to come to a point or a position where they can appreciate it for himself or herself. Young sometimes just like, well, no, this is a problem. Right? And that completely blows the corn out of the water. So obviously those people left and never came back. There's this one real interesting instance. It's one of the these really important examples of dream interpretation. Do I have time to go into this? Patient comes to him, right? He has done well for himself in his life. He's climbed quite high, right? He's come from very humble beginnings. The symptom that he comes to analysis for is mountain sickness. He feels queasy, right? It seems like there's been a change of altitude. He wants to get to the bottom of the symptoms, right? So there's a series of 3 dreams, right? And that was always about seeing things as part of the dream series rather than one big one. So the first one, he's back in his old village, right? He sees all his old friends there. They're huddled around him, but they exclude him, right? They hear them talking and basically saying about the dreamer, he doesn't come back here often, right? So that's the first dream. The second dream is let me get this in sequence, the escort dream, right? He has an important appointment to make, right? So he's trying to get to the train station, but he's thwarted at every step, right? So he forgot something, he has to run home and get it, someone stops him, etc., etc. Long story short, once he gets to the train station, he sees the train going out of the train station. What he begins to realize is that the track that the train is actually on is a huge S, right? It's a massive bend. And basically, the train is starting to move quite quickly. So what's going to happen if you take the corner too quickly? It derails, right? Okay. The third dream was more mythological, i.e. the patient is fighting this mythical beast, i.e. this crab lizard. And what he actually does is he pulls out a wand, taps it, and it completely disappears, right? So what does Young make of the dream series? So basically in the first dream, what it's basically saying is that he's gone too far. He doesn't remember where he's come from. He's lost his roots to a certain extent, right? The second dream, the escort dream, I mean, it seems pretty self-evident. He's moving too fast in the world, right? So he keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. And there's only, for at least this individual, a certain threshold that he reaches before he topples over. And what is actually coming crashing behind him is the neurosis that's coming behind him. The third dream, fighting this mythical beast. Usually, in mythology, in the hero's journey, when you're fighting the beast, you're kind of proactive, right? It's fighting with the sword. And here he pulls out the wand and just magically taps and it disappears. So basically what Young is saying is that he's making the object, he's taking it too lightly. He's thinking that he can just go off and forget about it, right? When really he's not really engaging with it. So basically what he tells his patient is the frank truth. You've gone too far in your life. You keep climbing and climbing, hence the symptoms of air sickness, right? Of motion sickness, of a feeling that you're in altitude. You better stop now. Of course the patient runs out and says no, takes the next big job and opportunity, and apparently what happens next, the person has completely derailed, right, and lost the job that he actually went off to achieve. So the whole point of that, if you will, is that sometimes your intuition could be absolutely correct, but there's a certain decorum to therapy, and Young sometimes lack that. Now in terms of his personal life, I mean ethically, many know that he had many mistresses, right? That therapeutic boundaries, if you will, do not exist at that time. So he put his wife Emma in a very difficult position. His relationship with Tony Wolf, I mean, he used to have Tony Wolf over for Sunday lunch, right? Which his wife absolutely hated. And there's obviously other affairs that went on as well. So as an individual, there's certainly a shadow side to Jung, but I think with MDR, he wanted all that to come out, but it was his own family that wanted to protect him, the image and the legacy of the Jung name, and that prevented the material from coming out in the actual autobiography. Yes?
The withstanding and catching of opposites, and not splitting oscillation. And how, because that brings an image to me, like two balls and then standing in the middle, and not moving to me signifies death. And actually who decides where the oscillation ends in order for it to not be, or to be considered not right, as withstanding. But also there's, the death rebirth cycle where you kind of need to go to the death to be reborn. So I'm curious about how Jung's focus on maintaining the ego maybe denies the impulsive side, so it's an avoidance of something that might pull you one way, even if it's destructive, and how maybe by allowing that pull, or that oscillation to then lead to the trapped connection, rather than staying in the middle. I don't know if it's significant, but...
Sure, I think it depends on the situation. Sometimes you need to act, sometimes you don't. But I think what Jung is really calling for is greater reflection. And that comes with a greater awareness of the unconscious and what actually triggers you. So if we look at an example, I mean, we've all had a bad boss, right? Bad boss that you absolutely hate. And there's a moment when you completely pop.
She hates you more than you do. That's where the problem is.
It felt good at the time, right? But now I'm regretting it. And what Jung is actually saying that, there are times when the regression can be healthy. But in that moment, if you realize the shadow side a bit more, right? If you were able to dialogue with it, to know what triggers you, perhaps at that point, rather than after, you could stand and reflect for a second. To step outside that situation, ask yourself, is this
She's not worth it.
that the person
She is dealing with her own insecurities, but she's blaming you for it. That's the problem. But you can't do anything about it, so what do? You babysit her?
Perhaps preservation that needs to, occur by not acting out. So I think, if anything, what Jung is saying is that...
Because she has never learned to grow up with her emotions and deal with her shit more than blaming it on someone else. That's the problem.
Activism, being proactive in the world, not just kind of sitting on the fence and waiting for things to play out by themselves. But at the same time, I think what's embedded in it is just the need for just great reflection, right? To pause and actually think about
It's the problem.
before jumping into anything like that. Yes.
I would like to know, from your standpoint, what you think it is that you're most has
What do you think it is?
contribute to life today or today's society?
Wow, that's a big one. That's a big one. 10 words. Wow, tweet. I have to say in the tweet. I can't speak for everyone, but I can definitely speak for my own engagement with Jung's ideas. And I think when I was younger, that numinous experience actually occurred. I was struggling through my studies to find really who I am, and that's one of the main points that Jung makes. You can't divorce your subjectivity from anything that you do. So any of you who might pursue your studies, etc., ask yourself, what are you trying to feel through your studies?
Ask
What
yourself.
aspect are you actually trying to speak to? When you write, when you do anything, our kind of subjectivity is ingrained in it. So basically, as an undergraduate, I was struggling, I was in history, I went to philosophy, I went to methodologist, jumping back and forth. And then I read Jung for the first time. And there was this complete numinous experience. So for anyone who's read Jung before, especially his more accessible works, it seems as if, oh my goodness, everything I've ever felt, this man is describing in this text, right? Something that he has said has spoken to the core of my being, right? I feel understood, I feel recognized, I feel heard, right? And I think most people who begin to read Young will have that experience. But then there certainly comes then the disenchantment, right? And I think that disenchantment is a large part of the process. Young's anti-Semitism, Young potentially as a racist, the problematic ways he held himself as an individual. Can we divorce the individual's actions from his psychology? Can we appreciate the ideas away from more problematic aspects of his life? And there were certainly moments, you know, working on a PhD on this topic where I felt completely disconnected from the field of history. So my topic really was, psychoanalysis in history, analytical psychology in history. And all I can remember was just being rejected by the history department constantly. No, your work is not reputable. No, that's not really history, etc., etc. So that dialogue soon closed. And I think for a long time, I really resented Jungian thinking and the Jungian approach because in many ways, especially within academia, it's so marginalized, right? But I think through that experience, I've kind of come again to be less angry, right? A lot of it is just based on my personal experiences. And what I actually appreciate about Jung is providing a framework to understand and to give voice to our own emotions, really, right? It's not the only framework. We could be using Freud, using Adler, Maslow, right? But essentially what it does, it allows us one way to approach, to understand, to appreciate who we are. I think that's the value of it. Yes? Yeah. So his most accessible works, Joseph Campbell compiled the Viking. It's also, I think, sometimes known as the Penguin or the Pelican reader, so a compilation of Young's most accessible vignettes, if you will. Anthony Storr, The Essential Young, is it Stevens, but it's called The Essential Young. There's Man and the Symbols, Modern Man in Search of the Soul. And obviously the quote-unquote autobiography, Memory Streams, Reflections. Right, but again, you know, it's paying heed to the audience, the intended audience itself. So obviously when you're reading this, you know, it's seductive, it's more easily accessible. But if you look at his collected works, which is massive, I mean, there's 18 volumes, and then plus with the work of the Philmont Foundation, we're trying to publish everything that is not published in Young. And it's a massive undertaking, you know, it kind of makes what's already there seem really small. But certainly, you know, those are the kind of main starting points, but at the same time taking results as well. Yes, sorry, go first and then you, yeah, please.
I was thinking about Young's wish, or you talked about giving one to approach wholeness, and that made me wonder about what if we're not actually whole, and so then this idea of wanting to become whole is what they've denied what we are, so maybe we are born imbalanced, and it's okay to be unconsciously and to very unconsciously and to very the other way around. And what if it's about accepting that rather than trying to shift something into a full wholeness? I don't know if that's a question, or what it is,
Yeah, I mean, I think if, you know, one is comfortable in one's skin, then fantastic, right? Maybe that's what individuation means for that particular individual. I think, you know, you brought up Christopher and which obviously relates to psychological types. And, you know, basically what Young is saying is that we are geared towards a very particular classification, i.e. we're either introverted, i.e. attracted to the inner life, or we're extroverted, attracted to the external life. And there are functions that go with it. So we have, I think, the most feeling, intuition, or sensation. And what Young is basically saying is, yes, there always will be that default position, but certainly we can try, I mean, we're not always that one thing. Right? That there's a lot of flexibility to psychological types as well. So in essence, we all have access to those other ways of being, right? If we can push ourselves to experience that. And depending on when you take a type test, your type will shift, depending on the situation, the context, etc. So I think the reason why we emphasize the need to kind of touch those inferior aspects of ourselves is that that's kind of the access to the unconscious, right? If for him we want to leave, perhaps not shut ourselves off from certain experiences, we need to speak to what we might perceive as our own weakness, right? So for instance, I love being up here, but I hate it as well, right? I'm completely introverted. I much prefer my own company, no offense to you. But, would I cut myself off, A, from living? And B, sometimes when you're teaching, you have that newness experience, especially when people get it. And I think the real indication is that when an introvert puts himself or herself into the position of needing to be extroverted, because we can do that, you feel incredibly tired afterwards, right? It completely drains your energy, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't put ourselves in those positions. But again, if one is comfortable in one's skin and one appreciates the position you're in, then fantastic, right? Because for young, individuation means different things for different people. A person who has agoraphobia, right, is able for the first time just to take the first step, right, into that larger public space. Maybe that's individuation for them. Who are we to say otherwise? Yes?
I thought that when you were talking about Jung and what you were saying about scapegoating others,
Yeah.
it kind of occurred to me, well, very strongly actually, what's happening today, particularly if you think about people like Donald Trump and everything that he's spouting. Would you, or would Jung, I don't know if you can speak for Jung, but could this be seen as a projection of our shadow?
Potentially. There's a book that's been published by the Jungians. Speak to me afterwards or send me an email. I can try to get the actual reference to you. But basically it's focusing more on his narcissism. I think the intervention of analytical psychology and depth psychology as a whole into the political realm is actually really important. The one thing I would say, and perhaps this doesn't answer your question, is that we really do have to be careful with psychobiography because it's one of my complexes. It deals with psychoanalysis and history in general, i.e. this notion of taking public figures, putting them on the couch, and introducing a psychology based on that. I'm not saying that you're doing it, I'm just saying that on the whole, there's a very delicate balance to this approach. The real extreme of it is if we end up something with the work of, let's say, Gerald Close. Anyone know who Gerald Close is? The US? No? So basically, he is famous for working closely with the CIA to produce these psychological biographies of key leaders, right? So Osama bin Laden, Hitler, etc., etc. And the real problematic is that big decisions have been made based on these profiles that may not necessarily be the best encapsulation or reflection of a particular individual. So if you look within the context of therapy and Freudian therapy, what's most important, right? The counter-transference and the transference, right? That crucial relationship within the analytic setting is the basis for knowledge, okay? But when that doesn't happen, when you don't have that relationship, the transference and counter-transference, how can we then begin to put someone on the couch and assume to have those insights on that particular individual character, right? Not to say that it's not helpful, but certainly there are kind of issues that we have to consider when we do that type of thing. But a lot of those books exist. Susan Rowland, one of our colleagues at Pacifica, has contributed a chapter. Tom Singer and his notion of the cultural complex is really engaging with this type of stuff as well. But I wrote a reply to Tom Singer, and he doesn't like me very much. So that kind of tells you the position that I'm at as opposed to others who are working on this. One thing I would say is that with psychobiography, you look at Freud, right? He's the father of psychobiography. Moses' monotheism, his analysis of Leonardo, etc. And actually he warned his early followers not to engage in wild psychoanalysis, right? And in essence, my position is that some of this kind of putting people on the couch without that other crucial knowledge, political figures, etc.
So what's next?
Kind of potentially leading ourselves down that path of wild psychoanalysis. A few more questions, yes.
More heart. I need to do some dialogues, huh? I need to do some dialogues. That's gonna be a big chunk of the future now that a lot is set up.
Yeah, there is still a lot.
The level design, the game design is kind of put together. It's going to be coding the features and writing the dialogues, and then when the dialogues is being written, then it's going to be doing the voices.
And study Jung as a discipline, not only as a figure, but as a movement, a collection of thoughts, etc. It's hard to say. All I can say that, one way that psychoanalytic ideas are being assessed critically is within psychosocial studies. You have the Center of Psychosocial Studies here at Berkeley. I hate to admit it because I'm at a competitor and a competing institution. But certainly places like the universities, London, Middlesex also have a center, and then UCL has a unit as well, the Anna Freud Center. So there are certainly pockets, but what I've found is that there's more of an openness here in the UK than anywhere else, which perhaps is quite difficult to believe. But I can certainly speak from my own experience, is that we're constantly needing to prove, right, the utility of studying Jung analytical psychology. Again, perhaps with reason, but yeah, it's certainly been problematic the last few years. Because more and more, the way academia is moving is that we should be looking at the kind of larger subjects. Anything that is niche doesn't necessarily have a place, because ultimately we need students, we need money, and if that money's not there, then departments close, even philosophy departments close. I mean, horrible stuff, art history departments. That's the nature of it, really. Yes?
And that thing in front of the one this by one there. So it's not about the exact one, it's what I'm understanding, for example, what's coming out of Trump and things like that, so recognizing our own shadow sometimes. Because why was he voted? You can't deny the fact that other people voted for him. That again shows the collective unconscious order shadowing on. So it's not about, at least people like this can make us aware of our own beliefs.
Sure, absolutely. I think if anything, whatever psychological approach we bring to the table, we have to be open to listening to the other perspective as well, right? That again, we're not using psychoanalysis with this kind of bulldozer approach of just forwarding one set of ideas or one way of accessing it. And really, the psychoanalytic approach needs to be used in conjunction with other ways of thinking, right? We can't divorce an understanding of politics without what the political scientists think, and what the sociologist thinks, and the anthropologists, etc. So really, hopefully what I'm trying to say is that psychoanalysis needs to be used in conjunction with other approaches. And if anything, there has to be a certain humility in knowing what the added value actually is. Right, I think I'm out of time, perhaps over time. Thank you very much, everyone. If you
That was really interesting. Healing collective trauma. Oh, Thomas. So, Aurélie. Oh, that was me. Aurélie is going to be done soon. Alexis is supposed to be Sarah, sorry. I can't see the whole name there. Yeah, Alexis is supposed to be Sarah. Yeah, there you go. I was like, who's Sandra? Sarah. Eliza. Hallo. Oof. Ethel, Lily. Oh, well, Lily could be Emily. J'avais peut-être mis... Oh non, well, Emily. Une autre Emily. Emily, si... Ça serait parfait. Parfait. Aurélie. Diana, that's not gonna happen. Zoe. So Donald is done. I need to map it. That would be easier to have a visual cue. So
there is Frau Doktor, Frau Professor, Frau Gewerkschaftsrat, the grandfather, the mother-in-law, the grandfather, the father, the son, the daughter, the sister. No, la femme, la n'existe pas.
That's very good.
Well, it is the idea, now that is an enormous important fact, which shows that in the German mind there is going on a particular myth, something very particular, and psychologists really should look out for these things, but they prefer to think that I'm a prophet.
Now, and just in the same context of hearing this, is of course a very interesting, remarkable set of statements here. How would you look at Hitler at this point? Would you see him as a personification of the symbol of the body?
No. You see, I couldn't possibly explain that very complicated fact. Sometimes it is too complicated. The European, the European is far more important than any model that have been produced.
Much broader than
No, because the medium power that all unbelievable in the German myth. And mind you, religiously he was a savior. He was meant to be a savior. That is why they put his photo upon the altars. Or somebody declared on his tombstone that he is happy that his highest and now he can lie in peace. So he's just the human myth,
Now, getting back to the idea of the self, and the self incorporates these unconscious factors. The self incorporates these unconscious
The self is really a term that designates the whole personality, because the whole personality of man is indescribable.
Yes.
His consciousness can be described. His unconscious cannot be described, because the unconscious, as I must repeat myself, is always unconscious.
Yeah.
It is really unconscious. It really does not know it.
It does not know about it.
And so we don't know our unconscious personality. We have hints, we have certain ideas, but we don't know it really. Nobody can say their man.
So, I need to make use of the Discord server to do all the voice acting stuff, huh?
Now, another set of ideas, of course, very, very well known in the world, that, of course, you have originated, center around the terms introversion and extroversion.
Yeah.
I know that you're aware of the fact that these terms have now become so widely known that the man on the street is using these terms constantly in describing his wife or his friends and so on and so forth. It's become probably the most used psychological concept by the layman we have.
Don't like the word complex. I have invented it too.
Yeah,
for the psycho constitution experiment.
Yeah, that's right.
But when you see this simply practical, because there are certain people who definitely are more influenced by their surroundings than by their own intentions. While there are other people who are more influenced by the subjective factor. Now the subjective factor, that's very characteristic, was understood by Freud as a sort of pathological auto-erotism.
Yeah, yeah.
Now this is a mistake. We have, Psyche has two important conditions. The one is the environmental influence,
Yes.
and the other is the given fact of the psyche as it is formed. The psyche is by no means tabula rasa. We are a definite mixture or combination of genes, and they are there from the very first moment of our life. And they give a definite character, even to the little child. And that is a subjective factor, looked at from the outside. Now, if you look at it from the inside, then it is just so as if you would observe the world. When you observe the world, you see people, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images, a world of images, generally known as fantasies. Yet these fantasies are facts. It is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life. Or a bridge is built. These houses were all fantasies. Everything you do here, all of the houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is of course not a tangible object, but it is a fact nevertheless. It is say a form of energy. Despite the fact we can't measure it. It is a manifestation of something. And that is a reality that is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that. It is no more, you can't show it. But it has been a fact. And so the psychic elements are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world within. Because the psyche, if you understand it as a phenomenon that takes place in so-called living bodies, then it is a quality of matter. As our body consists of matter, we discovered that this matter has another aspect, namely a psychic aspect. And so it is simply the world from within, seen from within. It is just as if we were seeing into another aspect of matter. This is an idea that is not my invention. The old Democritus already said, talk of the spiritus insertus atomis, namely the spirit that is inserted in atoms. That means psyche is a quality that appears in matter. Doesn't matter whether we understand it or not, but this is the conclusion we come to if we draw conclusions without prejudices. And so you see, the man who is going by the external world, by the influence of the external world, say society or perceptions, sense perceptions, thinks that he is more valid, because this is valid, this is real. And the man who goes by the subjective factor is not valid because subjective factor is nothing. No, that man is just as well based, because he is bases himself upon the world from within. And so he is
Delusional.
even if he says, oh, this is not just my fantasy.
This is exactly the fucking delusion. You can't fucking understand.
Of the external world, he will tell you, when you ask him, he will be apologetic about it. He will say, of course, yes, I know my fantasies. And he has always resentment. And as the world in general, particularly America, is extroverted like hell, the introvert has no...
Yeah, well, fuck you. You're delusional. It's not all about you. I'm not there to please you. My life is more important to me than your fucking satisfaction about fuck all. You're fucking delusional. That is exactly the fucking drama that Australia needs to wake up from. You are so fucking fucked up. You think everyone is there to serve you. Fuck you. The delusion, darling. The delusion. Well, like I said, not for me. Delusional.
The whole
You think that because someone is doing everything for you, you think that's good for them, that they serve you? You are bullying and mistreating people, and then you tell them it's good for them to be in that position? Delusional. If you're a cunt, people are gonna go away from you. That's the fucking point. That's what you don't want, because that is beneficial to you. But that's what is the problem. It's not beneficial for everyone else. People. This is so pathetic. This is so pathetic. It is all about me when I'm being bullied and mistreated like shit. This is what you don't understand. Not every fucking migrant is there to fucking polish and wipe your ass. That is the fucking issue and delusion that you need to wake up from. If you're a bunch of cunts to everyone, they're fucking gonna go away and stop polishing your ass. They're not there to serve you. That's what you don't want to understand, because you're delusional enough that everyone needs to serve me. Australia, you are so shit. You are so delusional about your fucking entitlement. This is pathetic. This is pathetic. Wow. The delusion of the entitlement of the Bogans. Wow. You're retarded, you're delusional, you're abusive, and you think people are gonna stay in that context? Keep believing. Narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic. Australia, mate. Fair and lucky. Amazing to be so retarded and delusioned about the entitlement you think you deserve. Fuck off. Your reality is far from being everyone else's reality. Disgusting to be so retarded and entitled.
Those are only terms to designate a certain function, a certain tendency, versus the tendency to be
Amazing
by environmental influences or
that they can't understand that their satisfaction from someone doing shit for them when it's not even keeping that someone alive. You think that because you have like the privilege of culture and job and even if you probably do your job worse than the migrant because you have that mateship, you think that's good enough for you to bully everyone into doing shit for you when you don't treat people properly? Fuck off. This is amazingly retarded to think they're the fucking king of the world when they're just a bunch of bogans bullying everyone into serving them because that other someone has no choice. That's the fucking coercive control that Australia needs to fucking break down, because you're not doing yourself a service. Even Australians, the brain drain, like you are exactly what toxicity is embodying. Completely delusional. This is so pathetic. The delusion, fair and lucky, all I see is fraud, bullying, and delusion. Fucking wake up. Nuts. Wake up, Australia. You're retarded as fuck. You think you're innovative when you can't see the innovation from 30 years ago? You think you're fair when you're just manipulating and bullying people? and blaming them when they stand up against your shittiness? That is on you. Fucking wake up. This is amazing. They can't understand, have a basic awareness of that. They're so fucking lost in there, blinded by the lights. Ugh. Amazing. Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy to be so deluded. Blows my mind. China is taking over and you're gonna be their bitch soon, don't worry. If it's not already the case, it's just that you have Australians being put in position of leadership when they can't understand, they have no emotional intelligence, but they're being put in position of leadership so they can coerce you into doing the shit that the soft power. You're the puppet and you think you're in charge, but no. You're gonna get fucked soon enough and you're gonna fucking eat the crab that you've been setting up for decades. And that's gonna be a huge slap in the face. That's the It's kind of funny because when you think about it, it's the British imperialism versus the Chinese soft power. That's all it is. Like in this world, it's British world, Chinese world, and you have the two kind of outsiders on the other side of the spectrum, which is Russia and Brazil. And everyone else is just trying to live and survive in the way they can through their spirituality and their art, and you have those few giant poles of political power that are fucking up everything else for everyone else. The manipulation from 1984 and the British Empire versus the Chinese soft power is what is going to crush everyone else.
And there you need your intuition, because you cannot possibly tell by your perceptions, by your sense perceptions, what is going to happen. For instance, you are planning in primeval force. You only see it for
and it's both, they're both using technocracies. Like China is, you think you're good with your Facebook and Silicon Valley. multiply that by, I don't know, 15 times and you have China catching up so quickly. They're already so much better than you and you don't even see it. It's the same British delusion, thinking they have the advantage, but you don't know. That's the soft power of China. It's there before you actually even notice it, and it's here. You just don't understand. I've been thinking for 10 years, within 50 years we're all going to be Chinese, and we will be.
That is quite unexpected. For miles there is no human habitation. You cannot swim, of course. It's all full of crocodiles. So what? Now, such an obstacle hasn't been foreseen. But it may be that you have had a hunch, that you remained in the last likely spot, and that you wait for the following day, that you can build a raft or something of the sort, or look out for possibilities. For instance, you also
This is just crazy, and they believe.
That constantly happens in our jungle called the city. You can have a hunch, something is going wrong, particularly when you are driving an automobile. Yeah. For instance, it is a day where nurses appear in the street, yeah. and they always try to get something interesting like a suicide, yeah. To be run over. That's what marvelous apparently. Yeah. And then you get a peculiar feeling, and really, at the next corner already is a second nurse that runs in front of the automobile. Yeah. You see, duplicity of cases, yeah. That is
the delusion.
We know that such chance happenings come in groups. Yeah. And so you see, we have constantly warnings, hints that consist perhaps in a slight feeling of uneasiness, uncertainty, fear. Now, on the brilliant circumstances, you pay attention to these things. They mean something. With us in our man-made, absolutely, apparently safe conditions.
The delusion. The art of the delusion.
Yeah, yet we still use it. So you find out intuitive types, for instance, amongst bankers, Wall Street men, yeah. Day for lunches, gamblers of all descriptions. Yeah. You find the type very frequently among doctors, because it helps them in their prognosis. Sometimes a case can look quite normal, as it were, and you don't foresee any complications. Yet, an inner voice tells you, now look up, here is something not quite all right, Yeah. You cannot tell why and how, but we have a lot of subliminal perceptions, sense perceptions. And for those, we probably draw a good deal of our intuitions, but that is perception by the way of the unconscious. Yeah. And you can observe that with intuitive types. You see, intuitive types very often do not perceive by their eyes or by their ears. They perceive by intuition. For instance, once it happened that I had a woman patient in the morning at 9 o'clock, and you see, I often smoke my pipe, and there was a certain smell of tobacco in the room, or a cigar, and so she came and said, "But you begin early." I said, "You call it early at 9 o'clock?" "Then no, you must have seen somebody at 8 o'clock." And I said, "How do you know?" There had been a man there that had come at 8 o'clock already. Then she said, "Oh, well, I just a hunch. There must have been a gentleman with you this morning." I said, but how do you know it was a gentleman? He said, "Oh, well, I just had the impression, the atmosphere was just like that gentleman." Yeah. All the time, the ashtray was under her nose, and there was a half-smoked cigar. Yeah. But she wouldn't notice it. Yeah. So you see, the intuitive is the type that doesn't see the stumbling block before his feet, but he is at for 10 miles.
Yeah. You make a distinction between an intuitive extrovert and an intuitive introvert.
Yes, all these types can be on either line.
For example, more specifically, what would be an example or a difference between an intuitive extrovert and an intuitive introvert?
Well, you have chosen a somewhat difficult case, because one of the most difficult types is the intuitive introvert. The intuitive extrovert you find among hunters, bankers, gamblers. That is quite understandable. The introvert is more difficult because he has attached to the subjective factor, namely the inner world. And of course that is now very difficult to understand, because what he sees are most uncommon things, and he doesn't like to talk of them. If he's not a fool, because he would spoil it all again by telling what he sees, because people won't understand it. Versus once I had a patient, a young woman about 27 or 8, and her first words were when I had treated her, she said, you know, doctor, I come to you because I have a snake in my abdomen. I said, what? Yes, a snake, a black snake, coiled up right in the bottom of my abdomen. And I must have made a rather bewildered face at her. And she said, you know, I don't mean it literally, but I should say it was a snake. It was a snake. Now, you see, our further conversation a little later was, as you said, that was about in the middle of our treatment that only lasted for 10 consultations. She had foretold me, I come 10 times, and then it's all right. I said, how do you know? Oh, I got a hunch. Yeah. And really, about the 5th or 6th hour, she said, doctor, I must tell you, the snake has risen. It is now about here. Hunch. And then, on the 10th day, I said, now, this is our last hour. And do you feel cured? And she said, beaming, she said, you know, this morning, it came up and came out of my mouth, and the head was golden. And those were the last words. Now, is that same girl, when it comes to reality, she came to me because she couldn't hear the step of her feet anymore. Yeah, because she walked on air.
Okay. So, Emily on Saturday.
And then she said, oh, pension so-and-so. Well, it is not just called pension, but it is a sort of pension. And it is, I never had heard of it. Yeah. And now, I'm curious, I never have heard of that place. Well, it's a very nice place indeed. Curious enough, the only young girls, they are very nice and very lively young girls, and they have a merry time. I often wish they would invite me to their merry evenings. And I think that they amuse themselves all alone. Oh no, they have plenty of young gentlemen coming in, and they have a beautiful time, but they never invite me. It turned out that it was a private problem. Yeah. And she was a perfectly decent girl, you know, of a very good family, not from here. She found that place, I don't know how. And she was totally unaware that they were all prostitutes. I said, for heaven's sake, you fell into a very dark place. You hasten to get out of it. That is was her sensation. Yeah. She doesn't see reality. Yeah. But she had hunches like anything.
Bad outcome, not bad enough.
Now, such a person cannot possibly speak of her experiences. Yeah. Because everybody would think she's absolutely crazy. Yeah. I myself was quite shocked when I thought, for heaven's sake, is that case a schizophrenia? Yeah. Because you don't hear that kind of thing. Right. But she assumed that the old man, of course, knows everything, and he even doesn't understand such kind of language. So you see, if when the intuitive, introverted intuitive would speak what he really perceives, and you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. That is a big disadvantage, but it is an enormous advantage in another way. Not to speak of the experience I got in that respect, but also in human relations. For instance, they come into the presence of somebody they don't know, and suddenly they have inner images. And those inner images give them a more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner.
Yeah.
You know, that is, but the case can also happen that they come into the presence of somebody who they don't know at all, not from man, and they know an important piece out of the biography of that person.
Yes. Yes.
And are not aware of it, and tell the story.
Yes.
And then perhaps is in the fire. Yes. You see, so the introverted, the intuitive has in a way a very difficult life, although one of the most interesting lives.
Yes.
But it is difficult often to get into their confidence.
Yes. Yes. Because you say they're afraid that people will think
the things that are interesting to them or are vital to them are utterly strange to the ordinary individual.
Yes.
The psychologist should know of such things. You see,
Yes.
you see, when people make psychology as a psychologist know what to do, well, the very first question is he extroverted or is he introverted?
Yes.
If we look at entirely different things.
Yes.
Is he a sensation type? Is he an intuitive type? Is he thinking? Is he feeling?
Yes.
That, because you see, these things are complicated, and they are still more complicated because the introverted thinker, for instance, is compensated by extroverted feeling.
Yes.
Or by inferior extroverted, archaic extroverted feeling.
Yes.
So an introverted thinker may be very crude in his feeling life. For instance, the introverted philosopher that is always carefully avoiding women will be married by his cook at the end.
Yes. Now, in other words, then we can take your extrovert categories and, in a sense, go through describing the sensation introvert type, sensation extrovert type, thinking introvert type, thinking extrovert type, and so on. In each case, it stems from really not real categories, but simply, as you say, an approach, something to sort of help us study a model.
It is just a sort of a skeleton. To which you have to add the flesh, or say it is a country mapped out, by triangulation points, and that doesn't mean the country consists of triangulation points.
Pour le futur, on va réimaginer tous les états qui représentent le bilan de climat ainsi que les mesures.
And so it is a means to an end. It only makes sense, such a scheme, when you deal with practical cases.
Of course, you're familiar with the work of Dr. J.B. Ryan at Duke University.
Yes.
And of course, some of his work in extrasensory perception and clairvoyance, as he called it, mental telepathy, and so on and so forth. Some of the descriptions in his work sound quite a bit at times like intuitive function operating. And in terms of your knowledge of this work, would you say that a person who has clairvoyance, in a sense, would then be an intuitive type? A person in his experiment is more likely to...
That's quite possible. Or,
So, Emily,
it can be
ça fait du sens. Après, ce que je dis à la voix de Thomas, il faut que j'ai la voix de Teach pour André.
There are two groups, the rational group and the irrational group. The rational group is thinking and feeling, because
Christophe, faudrait que je le refasse.
a rational result. feeling also a rational, there's a rational value.
Meredith was
That is
Eliza.
subjective feeling.
EJ.
Whereas sensation
Tegan.
must needs be irrational.
Velvet
Because
Teresa,
it
which
may
was
not
done.
present
Zuckerberg
its
Sheng,
it shall
Judy,
not present its facts.
Judy,
The real
Avi Cross.
ideal perception
We don't
is
need
that
your
you have a
penitence.
accurate perception of the things as they
Who
are.
is Judy supposed to be done by? I don't think I have anyone yet.
On the outside, the intuition does not look at the things as they are. That is present, that is anathema to the intuition. It looks
Judy. No, I don't have
ever
anyone.
so shortly
Who
at
can do
the things as they are.
Judy? The Wheel of Fortune.
Process, at the end of which we have seen something.
Ooh.
Now, so we see these people who
It's a real drag.
are always those people were introverted.
You make it hard on yourself in order to please some imaginary friend of yours. I've been writing that shit for years, and every time I come back, like, there's some good insights already in there. Live and let live. No one needs your judgmental bitching. Keep it to yourself, and no one will feel the need to push back on your ideology. The white savior syndrome. But I'm gonna save you. My concerns for your life. No one needs your concerns, bitch. You pay for sex while condemning it. The shame of being human and enjoy sex for what it is. Are you wise enough to play as God's messenger? Of course not. The God delusion. It's not because you believe you know everything that people around you will stop living their own life. Your delusion about the right, privilege, entitlement you think you have to be paid attention to is not a fact. It's perfect. Aren't we adult enough as societies to stop throwing tantrums? No, we're not. Lust will teach you how to love because your religions are more about oppression than love. Toxic love is not love. She's the perfect wasp. Toxic love is not love. The wasps. Oh, and that's perfect because it's greed, which is yellow. And Judy is yellow as well. So there's the black, the shadows of the light that is missing because that's perfect.
Relativation of time and space through the psyche.
I need a wasp.
That is what I have made evident. Yeah.
White savior syndrome.
Well, that's really good. Well, may I go a little further and first some of your recent work?
I need a wasp.
Is indeed very profound and
To get a
not
wasp.
too well known to many of our students.
Yeah, of course not.
And of course, this
Nobody reads these things. Only the general public.
and
Because my books are at least sold.
I'm referring now to the concept of synchronicity, which you have discussed, and which
That is
would have some relevance at this
amazing.
point in our discussion. Would you care to comment a little bit on this concept?
That is awfully complicated.
Who are you?
Well, to begin, of course, it is this kind of thinking has been started long ago.
Yeah, X-Men, Mitten and Proud, Jean Grey.
These results, I thought now we have at least a more or less dependable basis to argue on, But the argument was not understood at all. Because it's really very, very difficult
From the ashes.
You know, there are plenty of facts.
But it's 12. What?
Where you come across cases of a very peculiar kind of parallel events.
Personal blog. And you have 12,000 followers for sharing shit about X-Men.
Of a certain definite
but what do you create? Is that your art? No. Find this gorgeous commission, but that's not yours.
Something else, quite independently, happens that portrays just that thought. Yeah.
So you share shit about X-Men, but you don't do anything else than being a fan. You don't create. That's not what I want. I want creative.
Made evident by
I want someone creative.
There is a probability, it is something more than chance, that such a case occurs.
Oh, that's great.
I never made statistical experiments to except one in the way of time. I have made one for another purpose. But I have come across quite
that
a number
is
of
perfect.
cases where it was most astounding to find that two causal chains happened at the same time, but independent upon each other, so that you could say they have nothing to do with each other. Yeah. Of course, it's quite clear. For just so I speak of a red car, and at that moment a red car comes here. You see? Yes. Now I hadn't seen it. It was impossible because you were behind the building. In this moment, the red car appears. Now this is. That's mere chance. The Reich's experiment proves that these cases are not mere chances. Of course, many of these things are occurrences where we cannot apply such an argument, otherwise we would be superstitious. We can't say, now this car has appeared because here was some remarks have been made about the red car. Yes. It's not cause and effect. This is a miracle that the red car appears. It is not, it is chance, yes. Just chance. But these chances happen more often than chance allows. Yes.
This is just so perfect.
So the Rhine has a whole institute and with many co-workers, yes. And as the means, we have no means here, and I had no means to make such experiments, otherwise I probably would have done them. But it just was physically impossible. So I had to content myself with the facts. I began an examination of the human attitudes, namely how our consciousness functions.
What is the Wheel of Fortune?
Typical difference. The one assumes that the things evolve along the line of the sex instinct. The other assumes that things evolve along the line of the power drive. And there I was in between the two, that assumed the justification of our view, as others assume the same for others. And I knew that there are plenty of other ways in which things could be envisaged. And so I considered my scientific duty to examine first the condition of the human consciousness. That is the originator of ways of envisaging. It is the factor that produces attitudes, conscious attitudes towards certain phenomena. So when you know, for instance, that there are people who see the difference between red and green, you can take it for a fact that everybody sees that difference. Not at all. There are cases of Darwinism and so on, you know. The one sees this, the other sees that, and I tried to find out what the principal differences were. And that is the book about the types. And so first is introverted and extroverted attitude, then the functional aspects, in which of the four functions is predominant. Now mind you, these four functions were not a scheme I had invented and applied to psychology. On the contrary, I took quite a long time to discover that there is another type, but the thinking type. Because I thought my type is of course that is human. It is not. There are other people who decide the same problems I have to decide in an entirely different way. They look at things in an entirely different way. They have entirely different values. They are versus feeling types. And so, after a while, I discovered that there are intuitive types. They gave me much trouble. It took me over a year to become somewhat clear about the existence of intuitive types. And the last and the most unexpected was the sensation type. And only later on I saw that those are naturally the four aspects of conscious orientation. You can increase the number of principles, but I found the most simple way is the way I told you.
Yes.
As the division by four is the simple and natural division of a circle. I didn't know the symbolism of this particular classification. Only when I studied the archetypes, I became aware that it is a very important archetype that has a sense and an enormous role. I also found in the study of the types that it gives us a certain lead as to the personal nature of the unconscious, the personal quality of the unconscious in a given case. Where you take an extrovert, well, his unconscious has then an introverted quality, because all the extroverted qualities are played in consciousness, and the introvert reflects to the unconscious, therefore it has introverted quality, and so on with the functions the same. That gave me a lead of the diagnostic value. It helped me to understand my questions.
Well, Professor Jung, we have been discussing many of the very fundamental ideas in your theory, such as anima and animus, and of course, being representative of the whole idea of archetypes, as you explained it so interestingly. And we talked a little bit about this whole conception of the ego and the self and the persona as they are involved in all of this. And as we speak, of course, it begins to point in the direction of the sort of question that is so important as we try to understand the individual. And this centers around the problem of motivation, why the person does what he does. Now, to a great degree, you've already talked about this when you talked about archetypes and this whole matter. Now, in the work of Dr. Freud, he spoke of libido as an energy, and earlier we spoke of libido and the fact that you felt there was more than just sexual energy. You felt it to be something much broader. Now, you have certain principles about psychic energy which are indeed very provocative. Now, one of this principle is, I believe you refer to as the principle of entropy. Entropy.
Well, you know, I allude to it.
Yeah, yeah.
The main point is, you know, the the standpoint of energetics as applied to psychic phenomena. There you have no possibility to measure exactly. So it always remains a sort of an analogy. Freud, for instance, uses the term libido in the sense of a sexual energy. And that is not quite correct. You see, if it is
Correct.
sexual, then it is a power, like electricity, or any other form of manifestation of energy. Now, energy is a concept. Energy is a concept by which you try to express the analogies of all power manifestations, namely that they have a certain quantity, a certain intensity, and that there is a flow in one direction, namely to the ultimate suspension of the opposites. For instance, low, high, height, a lake on a mountain flows down until all the water was down, and then it is finished. And so we see something similar is the case in psychology. That you see from the fact that we get tired from intellectual work, or from conscious living, and then we must sleep in order to restore our power to discharge.
Okay, I think I need a break. There's no point keeping the work going when I'm actually not writing or creating anything. I've done a bit of work. I need to process what needs to be done next, and I need to deal with some life admin and real stuff. I'm getting hungry. I'm gonna go get some groceries, and I will see you another time. I will probably do a playtest on Twitch this afternoon. So please go to twitch.tv/aSMPgame, and I will see you there for that game that I saw you last week is supposed to be released today. So maybe I'm gonna check this one out. There's so many games, like too many fucking games to test. But that's the beauty of it. Never ending work.